Come on. Come on. Easy, girl. Hold on. Come on. Loose. Come on. Got you. Got you. Stay with me. Come on. Damn it. Oh. There you go. Breathe. Breathe. You're all right. Get off her. Come on. That's it. Hold. Damn it. Stay with me, girl. Easy. Let go. Let go, you monster. Yeah. Yeah. Come on. Breathe. Breathe. One more. It's over. It's over.
Easy, girl. It's all right. I'm not here to hurt you. Breathe. That's it. You're safe now, both of you. We'll get you help. Just stay with me. Easy, girl. You're all right. You're safe now. Stay with her, little one. She's strong. We're not going to hurt you. Breathe. There you go. We'll get help soon.
The afternoon sun bled across the African savanna, painting the vast grasslands a deep, almost melancholic orange. The intense heat of the day was finally beginning to break, releasing the ancient scent of dry earth and dusty acacia that mingled with the sharp, clean smell of a distant storm building on the horizon. For Kaelo, this was the quiet hour, that sacred moment when nature seemed to hold its breath before the swift descent of night. The air grew still, the cicadas' drone softening to a low hum. It was a time of transition, when predators began to stir and the herds grew restless, seeking the safety of the open plains. He felt the shift in the atmosphere not as a threat, but as a familiar rhythm, a pulse he had learned to read over countless years spent under this immense, unforgiving sky. The world was preparing to sleep, and he was its silent guardian. Leaning against the warm hood of his Jeep, Kaelo scanned the horizon, his gaze sweeping over the landscape he knew better than his own reflection. A veteran ranger, his patrol was more than a duty. It was a ritual, a silent dialogue with a land that spoke in whispers of wind and shadow. Every rustle of the tall grass, every distant call of a lone jackal was a word in a language he had long since mastered. But this evening, the conversation had fallen silent. It wasn't the peaceful quiet that often settled here, but an uneasy emptiness, an absence of sound that felt like a held breath. His body, attuned to the subtle cues of the wild, registered the change before his mind could name it. He pushed himself off the vehicle, his boots making no sound on the packed earth, his entire being focused on the void, the sudden, inexplicable stillness. The silence was no longer a simple absence of noise. It was a physical weight pressing down on the savanna. The usual evening chorus of birds had vanished, their familiar calls swallowed by the heavy air. Even the wind, which should have been carrying the cool promise of the coming rain, seemed to move with a strange, hesitant quality, carrying not relief, but a palpable sense of warning. Kaelo stood motionless, a statue carved from the landscape itself, his senses stretching out into the twilight. He could feel an invisible knot tightening in the atmosphere, a tension that vibrated just beneath the surface of the world. It was the kind of feeling that preceded a lightning strike or an ambush, a primal signal that the ancient, brutal balance of this place was on the verge of shattering. Something was profoundly wrong, and the land itself was screaming it in silence. He knew in his bones that he could not stay here, that the quiet was a lie, hiding something terrible. The routine was broken, the dialogue with the wild had been severed by an unseen violence, and his role as guardian was now being called upon. He had to move, to find the source of this disturbance, to confront whatever had silenced the world around him. The decision was made without a single thought, an instinct taking over where logic paused. He would walk toward the heart of that silence. Before we continue, comment below where you're watching this story from. I want to see how far these stories of courage travel. And if you can, please like and subscribe. It helps keep the mission to protect nature alive. With a final deep breath, he turned away from the safety of his vehicle and took the first step into the encroaching shadows. A sound ripped through the heavy air, sharp and unnatural. It wasn't the powerful roar of a predator on the hunt, but a choked, guttural cry that was swallowed by the Savannah almost as soon as it was made. It was a sound of finality, a death rattle that the earth itself seemed to be absorbing. Coelho was on his feet in an instant, his body moving before his mind had fully processed the noise. All thoughts of routine patrol vanished, replaced by a singular, sharp focus, honed by years of walking this fine line between life and death. He left the perceived safety of the vehicle behind, the solid metal frame shrinking in the distance as he moved forward on foot. The crunch of his boots on the dry, cracked earth was the only companion in a world that had suddenly become an active threat, its silence now charged with a palpable, electric warning of violence. He moved toward the echo of that sound, his path cutting through the tall, sun-bleached grass that swayed in a breeze that carried no relief. The world narrowed to what was directly in front of him, the vast expanse of the savannah closing in, becoming a claustrophobic corridor of rustling stalks and shifting shadows. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with a scent he knew all too well, the coppery tang of fear and spilled blood, faint but unmistakable. He could feel the ground vibrating with a low, inaudible frequency, a deep thrum of struggle that resonated through the soles of his boots. The setting sun cast his own shadow long and distorted before him, a dark specter leading him deeper into a confrontation he couldn't yet see, but could feel in every nerve ending. The silence that had returned was more menacing than before, a void waiting to be filled. His pace slowed as he approached a dense clearing, ringed by the skeletal, thorny branches of acacia trees. This was the epicenter, the source of that terrible, fleeting sound.
The air here was completely still, so stagnant it felt hard to draw a full breath, as if the oxygen itself was being consumed by whatever was happening within that natural arena. He dropped into a low crouch, his movements slow and deliberate, every muscle coiled with tension. Then he heard it again. Not the guttural cry, but something smaller, sharper. A high-pitched, desperate whimpering that sliced through the quiet. It was a sound of pure, helpless terror. The cry of something young and small trapped in a waking nightmare. It was a plea for a rescue that seemed impossible, a sound that guided his final, cautious steps toward the edge of the clearing. He reached the curtain of tall grass and paused, his heart hammering a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. He could feel the life and death struggle just feet away, a silent, brutal ballet hidden from view. Taking one last, steadying breath, he gently parted the dry stalks with his hands. The scene that unfolded before him froze the blood in his veins, a visceral tableau of primal force and fading life. A rock python, a titanic muscle of iridescent scales, was coiled with implacable, suffocating force around the body of a lioness. Her amber eyes, wide with a terror that was quickly dimming, met his. A few feet away, paralyzed by fear, her cub let out another sharp, whimpering cry. The entire world seemed to shrink to this single, horrific moment, a sight no one was ever prepared to witness. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, each second stretching into an eternity. The scene before him was a brutal masterpiece of nature's indifference, a tableau of life and death painted in the fading orange light. The rock python was a river of muscle and shimmering scales, its body coiled in a slow, suffocating embrace that was both horrifying and mesmerizing. He could see the dust kicked up by the struggle still hanging in the air, catching the last rays of the sun like golden flecks. The lioness's powerful form was being crushed, her breaths coming in shallow, desperate gasps that were barely visible. Her amber eyes, wide and losing their fire, were locked on him. A few feet away, her cub remained frozen, a small, trembling ball of terror whose high-pitched whimpers were the only sound in a world that had gone completely silent. His mind raced, a chaotic storm of protocol and instinct. Every ounce of his training, every lesson learned over years in the bush screamed at him to stay back, to call for backup, to never engage a predator of this size alone. Help was hours away, a distant promise that would arrive long after the last breath had been squeezed from the lioness. He could feel the heavy weight of his radio on his hip, a useless piece of plastic and wire in this moment. The Savannah itself seemed to hold its breath, the acacia trees standing like silent, skeletal judges watching to see what he would do. He was utterly alone, a solitary human figure standing at the precipice of a choice that defied all logic. To follow the rules meant certain death for the lioness. To intervene meant risking his own. He looked from the terrifying, impersonal power of the serpent to the eyes of the mother. In that gaze, he saw something that shattered all protocol. It wasn't just the primal fear of a trapped animal. It was a plea, a silent, desperate communication that cut straight through the barriers of species. She was a mother, and her final thoughts were not for herself, but for the small, helpless life she was leaving behind. The cub's cries were no longer just a sound. They were a nail being driven into his conscience with every sharp, piercing note. The vast, indifferent wilderness shrank until it contained only this small, tragic circle: the dying mother, the terrified child, and the man who had stumbled into their final moments. He could not be a passive observer to this. His humanity would not allow it. The internal storm ceased. A profound, almost chilling calm settled over him as the decision was made, not in his mind, but in his soul. The debate was over. His breathing steadied, his muscles tensed, and his focus narrowed to a single point. He took one last look at the lioness, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. His hand moved with a slow, deliberate grace, not to the radio, but to the worn leather hilt of the knife at his side. The sound of the sheath unsnapping was a sharp crack in the heavy silence, a declaration of intent. The long, polished blade slid free, catching the last glint of sunlight like a sliver of hope in the encroaching darkness. It was his answer. Without hesitation, he took a step forward, crossing the invisible line from witness to participant. He lunged. The world erupted from a frozen tableau into a chaotic blur of motion. Dust exploded from the dry ground, kicked up by his boots as he closed the distance in 2 desperate strides. The air, once still and heavy, was now thick with the scent of fear and dry earth. The python reacted instantly, its massive head swiveling toward this new threat with a speed that defied its size. A low, guttural hiss sliced through the air, a sound that felt ancient and full of primal warning. The serpent's body, a river of muscle and iridescent scales, tightened its grip on the lioness, a final, suffocating squeeze that sent a fresh wave of dust into the twilight.
Kalo's world narrowed to the space between him and the creature, a lethal dance floor where the only music was the hammering of his own heart against his ribs. The python's tail, thick as a tree limb, whipped through the air with incredible force, a blur of motion aimed directly at him. He threw himself to the side, the blow connecting with the ground where he had just stood, cracking the baked earth with an audible thud. He could feel the shockwave through the soles of his boots. The snake was not just a constrictor, it was a fighter, aware and brutally efficient. He scrambled back to his feet, the knife held low, his eyes scanning the shifting coils for any sign of a vulnerability. The lioness was almost completely obscured by the serpent's body, her faint, ragged breaths the only sign she was still alive. He circled the unfolding tragedy, his movements careful and deliberate, every nerve ending screaming with the instinct for survival, while his mind searched desperately for a way to intervene. The air was suffocating, a cocktail of animal musk, the coppery tang of blood, and the raw scent of terror. He could feel the sweat stinging his eyes, his shirt soaked and clinging to his back.
The fight was a grueling ballet of feints and dodges, with Kalo constantly moving to avoid the lashing tail and the striking head. The sheer physical presence of the snake was overwhelming, a living embodiment of nature's raw, indifferent power. He could hear the rasp of its scales scraping against the dirt and the low, constant hiss that seemed to fill the entire clearing. His own breath came in short, ragged bursts, the sound loud in the enclosed space. He was a solitary man armed with a single blade, facing down a primordial force that had ruled this land long before his own kind had ever walked it. He saw the shift in the creature's focus. The python, for a fraction of a second, ignored him, its entire being dedicated to the final crushing act. The massive coils contracted with a visible, rippling wave of power. A soft, choked sound escaped the lioness, a final exhalation of life being squeezed from her lungs. In that horrifying moment of finality, he saw his opening. A small patch of flesh near the creature's head, momentarily exposed as it adjusted its grip. It was a suicidal gamble, requiring him to move inside the python's lethal range to get closer than any sane person ever would. But there was no other choice. The world seemed to slow down, the cub's whimpering cries fading into a distant echo as he committed everything to this one desperate chance. He threw himself forward, his body a missile of pure intent. The ground rushed up to meet him as he slid through the dust, closing the distance in a heartbeat. He brought the knife up, his arm muscles screaming with the effort, and plunged the blade into the exposed flesh. The resistance was immense, like driving steel through a thick, rubbery hide. The snake's body convulsed violently, a wave of pure, unadulterated power that nearly threw him off. He held on, his knuckles white, and drove the blade in again and then again, a frantic, brutal rhythm of survival. The serpent's hiss turned into a wet, gurgling roar of agony as it thrashed wildly, its coils flailing with blind, destructive force. He was caught in the storm now, a part of the violent chaos he had unleashed. The python's thrashing became a final spastic dance of death. Its massive body whipped back and forth, smashing against the ground and the nearby acacia trees with terrifying force. Then, as suddenly as the violence had begun, it stopped. The immense weight of the creature went limp, a dead weight of muscle and scale that settled heavily over the lioness. A profound, echoing silence descended upon the clearing. So absolute it felt like a physical blow. The only sound was his own harsh, ragged gasps for air as he stumbled backward, his entire body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. He stood there, his chest heaving, and stared at the scene. The serpent was still. The lioness was still. The world held its breath, and in that terrible, unending quiet, one question screamed louder than any sound. Was he too late? The world fell away into a profound, echoing quiet, the violence of the last few minutes replaced by a stillness so complete it felt heavier than any sound. Kalo stood frozen, his chest heaving, the knife a useless weight in his trembling hand. Sweat and dust caked his skin, and every muscle in his body screamed with a deep, bone-weary ache. The coppery scent of blood mixed with the smell of upturned earth and the faint, clean promise of the approaching storm. He could hear his own ragged breaths, loud and harsh in the twilight, and the frantic, unsteady beat of his own heart. He was alone, a solitary figure standing in the aftermath of a war he had not intended to fight. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the lioness. She lay utterly still, a broken queen on a battlefield of her own making. The dead weight of the python a terrible monument to her struggle. For a horrifying second, he believed he had failed. But then he saw it. The faint, almost imperceptible rise and fall of her flank, a shallow, erratic rhythm that was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Her golden coat was matted with dirt and marked by the deep, brutal bruising of the serpent's coils. He knelt, his exhaustion forgotten, and watched the fragile pulse of her life. The cub, A small ball of trembling fur crept forward with a caution that broke his heart, its wide eyes fixed on its mother. He reached for his radio, his voice a raw, cracked thing as he called for veterinary support, the words swallowed by the immense silence. The wait was an eternity, suspended between dusk and night. The sky bled from orange to a deep, bruised purple, and the first stars began to prick the darkness. Kaelo did not move from his vigil, a silent guardian watching over the two creatures. In the stillness, the boundaries between them seemed to dissolve. He was not a ranger, and she was not a predator. They were simply two survivors, bound by the shared, visceral memory of the fight. He saw in her stillness an incredible resilience, a maternal will that had refused to surrender, even as life was being squeezed from her. The wind grew cooler, carrying the scent of rain, and the distant thunder rumbled closer, a slow, deep drumbeat for the unfolding drama. The world had shrunk to this small clearing, a sacred space of vulnerability and shared existence under the vast African sky. The cub, emboldened by the long quiet, finally reached its mother, nudging her face with its own, letting out a soft, questioning whimper. For a long, heart-stopping moment, there was no response, and the crushing weight of failure began to settle over Kaelo. Then, a miracle. A faint tremor ran through the lioness's massive form. With an effort that seemed to take every last ounce of her strength, she lifted her head, just an inch. Her eyes, clouded with pain but undeniably alive, found her cub. Her rough tongue slid out, and she gave the small creature one slow, deliberate lick across its brow. It was a minimal gesture, a whisper of life in the gathering darkness, but it was enough. It was a promise. It was a spark of hope that ignited in the vast, lonely quiet, pushing back the encroaching night and leaving him suspended in fragile, aching relief. The distant rumble grew into the soft crunch of tires on dry earth, and then a pair of headlights cut through the deep purple of the pre-dawn sky, washing the clearing in a sterile white light. The spell was broken. A vehicle, marked with the familiar insignia of the Wildlife Veterinary Unit, came to a slow, respectful stop. Doors opened and closed with a quiet finality, and figures moved with a practiced, almost silent efficiency that spoke of countless nights like this one. Kaelo stepped back, a silent transfer of responsibility passing between him and the lead vet. He was no longer the fighter. He was a witness now, watching as the quiet hum of their equipment replaced the sound of his own ragged breathing. The air, once thick with the scent of blood and fear, now carried the faint, antiseptic smell of medicine, a scent of intervention and fragile hope. There was no rush, only a calm, methodical rhythm to their work. A single quiet hiss from a dart gun, and the lioness's tense body finally relaxed into a deep, medicated sleep, her breathing evening out into a slow, steady pulse. The team moved around her, their hands working with a gentle precision that was a stark contrast to the brutal violence that had just occurred here. They cleaned the deep contusions, administered antibiotics, and checked for broken bones, their low voices a soft murmur under the vast, starry sky. The cub was carefully coaxed into a carrier, its whimpers softening as it was placed near the reassuring scent of its mother on the stretcher. Kaelo watched it all from the shadows, a silent observer to this quiet act of mending, feeling the immense weight of the struggle begin to lift as human compassion worked to undo the damage. With a final check, the stretcher was lifted, and the lioness was secured inside the vehicle. The door slid shut with a soft click, a sound of closure. Kaelo watched as the truck turned, its red taillights shrinking into pinpricks of light before being swallowed completely by the Savannah. He was alone again, but the silence was different now. It was no longer heavy with dread, but filled with a deep, resonant peace. As if on cue, The first pale light of dawn began to bleed across the eastern horizon, chasing away the deep indigo of the night and painting the acacia trees in soft, hopeful shades of pink and gold. A clean, cool breeze stirred the tall grass, carrying the scent of dew and damp earth. And then a single, clear note from a bush shrike cut through the quiet, a sound he hadn't realized he had missed so deeply. He turned and began the slow walk back toward his jeep, each step a conscious effort. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that made his limbs feel like lead. His muscles ached, his hands still throbbed from the force of the fight, and he could feel the grit of dust and dried sweat on his skin. Yet, for all the physical depletion, a strange and unfamiliar lightness was settling in his chest, a quiet sense of rightness that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with balance.
He had not merely followed a protocol or completed a task. He had answered a silent call, stepping into a sacred, violent space and holding the line for a life that was not his own. The rising sun warmed his back, a silent acknowledgement from a world that was slowly, beautifully returning to its rhythm. The clearing was bathed in the full, clean light of morning, a soft gold that filtered through the acacia branches and made the dew on the tall grass glitter like scattered diamonds. The air, washed clean by the distant storm, smelled of damp earth and life. Where there had been a chaotic stage of dust and violence, there was now only a profound stillness, the ground bearing the silent scars of the struggle. A flock of weaver birds, their silence broken, chattered from the safety of a nearby tree, their bright yellow a stark contrast to the memory of the night. The savannah was breathing again, its rhythm restored, its ancient pulse beating steadily under the warmth of the rising sun. Caielo stood at the edge of the space, not as a conqueror, but as a humble part of the landscape, a silent witness to the world's quiet, resilient return to balance. This moment would never be written in an official report, its details confined to the silent archives of memory. It was a story shared only between a man, the animals he had saved, and the vast, impartial savannah that had watched it all unfold. The brutal details of the fight, the terror in the lioness's eyes, the desperate weight of the decision, these things were now a part of him, etched not onto paper, but into the very fiber of his being. He felt an exhaustion so deep it went beyond muscle and bone, yet it was coupled with a quiet, resonant clarity. He understood that some lines are drawn not by rules, but by instinct, and that true guardianship is not about observing from a distance, but about having the courage to step into the fray when life itself hangs in the balance, a choice made without audience or applause. He raised his gaze to the horizon, where the great plains stretched out into an endless sea of green and gold under the immense blue sky. A distant herd of wildebeest moved like a slow, dark river across the landscape, their movements unhurried and peaceful. The world was as it should be, a complex and beautiful tapestry of survival, where every thread was connected. The struggle of the lioness was not an isolated event, but a part of this larger story, a testament to the fierce, unbreakable will to live that animates every creature here. He had not conquered a monster, he had simply helped restore a single vital thread to that tapestry, ensuring that a mother's legacy would continue, carried on by the small, determined life that now followed in her footsteps somewhere out in the vast, open wild. He turned and walked away, his silhouette slowly dissolving back into the landscape from which he had emerged. The savannah did not offer thanks, it simply continued its timeless rhythm, the sounds of life swelling to fill the space his presence left behind. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the distant calls of birds and the low hum of insects, a symphony of resilience that played on, indifferent and eternal. The story did not end here in this clearing. It would live on in the quiet strength of a lioness teaching her cub to hunt, in the silent respect of a shared glance across the plains, and in the deep, unspoken understanding carried in a ranger's heart. In nature, every life saved is a way of ensuring your own survival too.